And today we're going to begin to look at the economy in aggregate. So what exactly is meant by aggregate? Aggregate means to put together or to combine. So today we're going to begin to talk about totals for putting all of the markets together. Instead of talking about the market for socks, we're going to talk about the market for consumer goods or the market in general. And we're going to put them all together in one piece. So what we're looking at today is truly macroeconomics. We're truly talking about how does the economy in total, how does it operate? This really relates to what we talked about last time. Essentially what we're attempting to do is to determine what sorts of things would change the GDP numbers. Last time we talked about GDP and how we calculate those. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, once we have some figures for those, how could we determine what the equilibrium one is, or how could we determine what the level of output is going to be. When we look at individual goods, we have a price and a quantity. And we have the interaction of demand and supply in terms of price and quantity. So we drew the graphs in which we had downward sloping demand curves and an upward sloping supply curve, and the two intersected, and we ended up with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. You could do that for individual participants. That is, you could do it for a single individual who has a demand for pizza as an example, and there's one supplier, and so they end up with an equilibrium price and quantity. When you start aggregating, that doesn't really make sense. Then we begin to talk about price levels, that is, not a single price, but a price level. And on the expenditure side, we begin to talk about GDP figures. So now we're looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and we're talking about price levels and real GDP figures. So we have the same sort of demand curve that we had before. If we add together a number of demand curves that are downward sloping, we're going to end up with a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. What has changed is the two axes now have new names. Now they have price level and real GDP. Before we had prices because we're only looking at a single good, but now we're looking at a whole series of goods. So we're talking about a price level. Before we had a quantity of the good, but now we're talking about a quantity of a whole array of goods, so we have real GDP instead of a Q number. So you could think of real GDP as the aggregate measure of quantity, and you could think of price level as the aggregate level of prices. Since individual demands are downward sloping, then the aggregate demand is going to be downward sloping as well. What sorts of things might shift that curve or move it? Well, a curve moves anytime there's a change in total expenditures. Anything that would increase total expenditures would increase aggregate demand. Anything that would decrease total expenditures would decrease aggregate demand, would actually move it from place to place. And I'll remind you that we're not talking about a movement along the aggregate demand curve, we're talking about a movement of the entire. So the analogy here is this is a change, either an increase or a decrease in aggregate demand, not a movement along the line. Now, last time we learned that aggregate expenditures are composed of consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. Four pieces of that puzzle, consumption being the largest, government purchases being the second largest, investment being the third largest, and we determined that net exports actually could be a negative number. It could actually subtract from it. So what sorts of things would affect these components? And we're going to look at each one of them individually. What could change consumption levels? Well, the biggest thing that could change consumption levels is the wealth of households. As households feel wealthier, they will spend more. As they feel poorer, they'll spend less. And this is one of the reasons that economists, as they're trying to predict GDP figures, are very interested in what happens to the largest assets that are available in the household. In other words, as housing prices go down, then consumers don't feel as wealthy, and so as a result, they don't spend as much money. As the price of cars goes up, then they do feel wealthier to the extent that they already own cars, and so they'll spend more money. So that's kind of an indicator of how well they're doing. It's almost a consumer sentiment issue. They also are affected by interest rates. Interest rates determine certain kinds of consumption. As interest rates go up, people buy less cars, people buy less houses, and people buy less consumer durables, as we call them, such as stoves, refrigerators, washers, dryers, all of the large purchases. Interest rates don't affect all of our consumption purchases, but they certainly affect certain categories. As interest rates decrease, consumption will increase, and essentially what happens is, as interest rates go above a certain level, people simply put off the purchases. So you wait another year or two to buy a car, or you wait another year or two to get a new refrigerator, or you wait another year or two to put in that new air conditioning system that you wanted to put in. So interest rates affect consumption by either encouraging it or discouraging it, and you might want to think of this as sort of a funny price. It is in fact a funny price. Tax changes can either increase or decrease consumption. A decrease in taxes is usually accompanied by an increase in consumption. So as taxes go down, consumption goes up. On the other side, as taxes go up, consumption goes down. On the investment side, there are two important criteria by which businesses determine whether they're going to invest or not. They first compare the expected return, or they create the expected return of the investment, and then they compare it with the interest rate. If the expected return is greater than the interest rate, then they'll decide to make the investment. So what do we mean by that? The expected return is just the amount of the profits that we expect on an annual basis divided by the cost of the investment. So you see here we've got Wilmer's Widgets again. They're considering buying a new piece of equipment. The piece of equipment costs $12 million. It's expected to generate $900,000. What is the expected rate of return for that? Well, we simply take the $900,000, divide it by the $12 million, and we get 7.5% for our expected return. In other words, if we invest the $12 million, we expect to return 7.5% per year for this particular investment. If Wilmer can borrow his money for 6%, then he'll make the investment. That is, the 6% is less than the 7.5%. So the difference between what he's going to pay for the money, the difference in what he's going to pay to borrow the $12 million and what he's expecting to return will be all profits for him. So he will get the 1.5% difference. If on the other hand, interest rate is 10%, that's more than the expected return, so he's actually going to lose money. He'll actually lose 2.5% on this. So he wouldn't make the investment. So the important decision criteria for investment is, first, what is the expected return? And second, what is the interest rate? Now remember, interest rates affected consumers as well, but it's a much more crucial a factor of investment because it determines whether certain projects are actually going to be feasible or not. And so we see that their expectations about future returns can get more optimistic or more pessimistic. That is, he might decide, well, the economy looks good, and so maybe we'll make $1 million off of this rather than the $900,000. In which case the investment looks even more appealing. On the other hand, he may get more pessimistic. As an example, he may decide, well, the economy is moving into a recession. I really can't depend on the 900,000. I may only get 600,000. And so as a result, his expectation about the future return goes down, and it makes the investment less attractive. Likewise, as interest rates go up or down, and even the expectation of them going up or down changes, then that changes the investment decision. So one of the things that affects aggregate demand are interest rates, and interest rates affects not only the consumption portion, which we remember is 60 or 70% of the total, but it also affects investment as well. Net exports can change for one of two reasons. Either a change in the real GDP of our trading partners or a change in the exchange rate. If we have a change in the real GDP of our trading partners, that is, if our trading partners suddenly become much richer, they likely will buy more goods and services from us, and so as a result, our exports will increase. On the other hand, the exchange rate is the rate at which we exchange our currency for their currency. If our currency gets cheaper relative to their currency, then the result is the equivalent of lowering our prices. And so our exports, which are imports for them obviously, but our exports suddenly are on a better footing. That is, they're cheaper. And so it'll make them more attractive to them. So the two things that will increase our exports are increases in GDP with our trading partners and decreases in the exchange rate. In other words, the dollar getting cheaper is always an advantage in terms of our exports. Now, one thing that you need to think about is who are our trading partners, and our largest trading partner is actually Canada. Behind them are some of the European countries, but our largest one by far is Canada. So when we see an increase in GDP in Canada, that bodes well for us because they're our largest trading partner. When we see a decrease in the American dollar versus the Canadian dollar, it bodes well for our exports because that makes our prices cheaper and therefore more attractive to them. On the other side of the market, we have aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the total quantity of goods and services at different price levels. Similar to what we just said, that is, we're going to add together all of the various different goods and services that are supplied throughout the economy. And now, rather than talking about a single price, we begin to talk about a price level. And rather than talk about a quantity of a particular good, we begin to talk about the quantity of all goods, which is known as real GDP. Now again, we need to discuss what sorts of things might change this curve, what sorts of things would move this curve. And really they all boil down to one thing, and that is changes in the cost of the factors which underlie the aggregate supply curve. The largest of those are wage rates. In most goods and services, the largest single piece of production cost are people. And so anytime wage rates change, it's going to move the entire aggregate supply curve. Likewise, any changes in non-labor inputs will cause the same sort of thing. So while labor inputs are the most expensive or the largest portion, especially for services as opposed to goods, there are other components as well. In other words, if the raw materials change or the cost of capital changes or something of that sort. Third are changes in productivity. Changes in productivity mean that we can get more goods or services out of the same level of labor inputs. So in other words, we get more goods, but we don't have to increase the number of laborers. And that has the effect of actually reducing cost. This usually takes place when we get some sort of product, some sort of technology which increases productivity. But it also could happen as a result of training, as a result of some sort of better organization, some sort of better control over inventories, any of those sorts of things. They have the impact of changing prices without actually changing prices. And finally, the last of these are supply shocks. That is, the necessary inputs might not be available. And if those are not available, as an example, if we can't find enough petroleum or there's not enough natural gas available or something of that sort, then that has the effect of actually moving the entire aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve is built contingent upon the availability of those inputs and also the prices of those inputs. So anything that changes the prices of those inputs or the availability of those inputs will change the entire aggregate supply curve. Now, putting the two together, putting both the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply together, we end up with an equilibrium price level and an equilibrium real GDP. So this is how the GDP in our economy is determined. Now, an interesting question is, what happens if something changes? Now, we've talked about the sorts of things that might change, and I'll give you examples of those as we change. Well, it could change on either side. Let's look first at what happens if there's a change in aggregate demand. That is, suppose aggregate demand increases. This could take place because consumers get more optimistic and decide that they want to buy more goods and services. They feel wealthier, or to the extent that they buy goods on credit. If interest rates were to go down or something of that sort, then we would get an increase in aggregate demand. So we moved from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. Notice that the result of that is two effects. First, the one that we're typically looking for is it actually increases real GDP. So the economy actually produces more goods and services. The one we typically are not looking for is the one over here, and that is price level actually increases. So if we were to follow some sort of policy, such as decreasing taxes, then the result, or increasing government expenditures, then the result would be that we would get more goods and services produced, but we'd also get increases in prices at the same time. So we're typically looking for the behavior that we get down at the bottom of the graph, that is an increase in real GDP, but as a side effect, we also get increases in price levels. So we're kind of balancing these two off one against the other. Now we're going to see that this is going to come back when we start talking about Keynesian model. We're going to see that this is going to come back and become an important consideration for us. On the other hand, suppose aggregate demand decreased. Suppose we gave a tax increase, or we decided to cut back on our expenditures. Suppose we as a government were to decide we're going to spend less money than we did in the past, or we're going to increase taxes, or our consumers all suddenly feel poorer than they did before, housing prices drops or something of that sort. Notice that we're going to get two effects as a result of that. Real GDP is going to fall, which is a side effect we'd prefer not to happen. But a good thing does happen, and that is price levels will actually fall. I say that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing for prices to fall, but it certainly is superior to having prices go up. So a decrease in aggregate demand has the impact of reducing total output and also reducing the price level. Now remember, on this axis we're looking at real GDP, not nominal GDP. So this is actually less goods and services. We're actually getting less bread, less shirts, less cars, less everything. So it's not just a reduction in the nominal GDP, it's a reduction in the real GDP. On the other side, what would happen if we had an increase in aggregate supply? This could take place because wage rates have decreased, which is unlikely, or that productivity has increased. We've implemented some sort of technology which causes each and every worker to be able to produce more, or raw materials have gone down in price. We move from aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. This time we get a little bit better, a little more consistent outcome, don't we? Because what we would be looking for is this increase in real GDP. There are more real goods and services being produced, but notice we also got a decrease in the price level as well. Now when we moved on the demand side, we got more real GDP, but the offsetting thing was that we got higher prices as well. Notice that in this case, we not only get an increase in real GDP, but we also get a reduction in prices as well, which again may not necessarily be good, but it certainly is not as bad as having prices go up. On the other hand, suppose we had a decrease in aggregate supply. This could happen because wage rates go up, because the cost of raw materials goes up, interest rates go up, anything of that sort. We could even change taxes on the corporate structure and cause this. The result is we move from aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. We have a decrease in real GDP. We have less goods and services produced, and we also have an increase in the price level. This is kind of the worst of all worlds here. Not only do we get less goods and services, but their prices are going up as well. The prices are not only, the prices that are passing through to you as a consumer are going up, and there's less goods and services out there. So this is obviously the case that we want to avoid if at all possible. Now, we're going to, in the next session, look a little bit at what sorts of decisions we might make that would actually influence these numbers. And we can already see that in some cases, as we make those decisions, we're actually going to have trade-offs. It's actually going to be the case that some things improve our lot, but have some countervailing sorts of influences. As an example, we increase real GDP, but we also increase prices at the same time. We're going to actually begin to look at two different ways of approaching this, two different ways of looking at the economy in aggregate, and two different explanations of how the economy operates the way it does, and why it's the case that these equilibriums occur the way they do. We're going to end up liking parts of each one of them, and ultimately what we're probably going to end up doing is saying, well, maybe let's try and take the best of each one of them and be flexible in terms of which one we use given the circumstances we see around us. It's a short one today, but that's all for today, and we'll see you next time.